Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett. Tony Kinnett.
Tony Kinnett.
Host of the Tony Kinnett Cast.
Let's get down to business.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Here on the Daily Signal.
Hey, welcome to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated this evening, live from Washington, D.C., our nation's very nasty-smelling and scummy capital. It's good to be with you because right now, the best thing that can be described of the Democratic National Campaign currently trying their darn tootnest to get Kamala Harris and her VP running mate, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, elected. The best way that can be described is just flailing. If you can imagine the wacky, waving, inflatable arm tube man at all of the used car dealerships, just wildly flailing around, trying very desperately to get anything to stick. This truly is what characterizes the campaign. Because right now, the polls are, again, not getting any better. They are getting worse for Kamala Harris. Those that are fans of the Harris campaign are desperately clinging to like very small, minor campaign moments as like somehow campaign enders, and we'll get to that in just a second. But this attitude of flailing is getting increasingly pathetic given how bad the campaign is starting to get. And the reason I point this out is because the Trump-Vance campaign is pretty much just taking it easy. They're not really saying anything bold and new. They're just pointing at Harris, Biden, and Walz, which is the strategy, right? If this election ends up being the Americans' judgment on the Biden-Harris administration, Trump likely walks away with not just one, but several of the crucial swing states that he needs in order to make it to 270 electoral college votes. Which brings us to November 5th. Set your clocks, set your calendars at 6 p.m. Eastern. I and my co-host Elise McHugh will be joining you for, first of all, two very delicious ribeye steaks provided by Well Done Beef. Now, these are not going to be cooked well done, I assure you. They will be pan-fried in salted butter, hers to medium well, mine to just barely over rare. We'll enjoy those with you as we settle in for a night of election coverage. Like our ultimate debate coverage, which was popular, we're thrilled that you guys enjoyed it. We're going to be sending out, I would say, a certain number of hours of the election night coverage as we count our way up to 270. And of course, take a look at the down the ballot races as well. That will be here. That will be at the Daily Signal, all our social media platforms, YouTube and X, as well as on our syndicated radio and TV partners. We're going to start that at 6, and we're going to go until our producers keel over from exhaustion or we call some type of electoral winner. And at the moment, the best that can be said is that one party is working very, very diligently. One party is flailing around very, very desperately. And that desperation comes in this bizarre campaign move in which Donald Trump at a recent rally, all right, this was on October 14th, he was on stage, and this was at Oaks, Pennsylvania. And about 30 minutes in, two attendees had significant medical emergencies. And Donald Trump, like he did in his Butler, Pennsylvania rally, when someone had a medical emergency, he just stopped the rally. He didn't try to, press on through it or ask emergency crews to get him out of here real quickly. He just stopped. And he actually ended up asking the crew of the rally to start playing some music that he liked. So Hallelujah, and then Ave Maria again. And Trump, just kind of enjoyed the moment. And the Harris campaign decided that they were going to suggest that this 30-minute interval where Trump waited for the medical emergencies to end and just kind of swayed to some music with the crowd, that this was an example that Trump had lost it mentally. This is some kind of a senior moment for Trump. First of all, very, very bold move for the Harris-Walz campaign to try so desperately to suggest Trump is out here having extreme mental moments when Kamala Harris to this day still suggests that Joe Biden is completely and mentally fit and present as the president of the United States. As a reminder, Kamala Harris has not only the constitutional opportunity, not only the constitutional right, but the constitutional obligation, with Biden being not there, being so dementia-ridden, he cannot even remember the names of foreign leaders he is speaking to and sharing a stage with, that this man is still somehow totally fine. So, first of all, no. Number two, well, here, this is This is Kamala Harris, I guess, trying to suggest that Trump is unstable because he stood there and listened to music with the crowd.
Questions about Donald Trump's. Once again, there's been a lot of recent questions based on an event he did recently. He played music for about 30 minutes straight. Just questions about his mental fitness for office at this point. Do you think Donald Trump needs to take a cognitive test?
Well, I'm going to say what I have said publicly and will say many times based on my observations, and I think the observations of many. Donald Trump is increasingly unstable. And as has been said by the people who have worked closely with him, even when he was president, he's unfit to be president of the United States.
Do you support?
So I don't really know if this is going to sink or this is going to float. It's really not doing very much. It's very wild to suggest this is some kind of a huge campaign-ending moment, as a lot of people over at like Project Lincoln, for example, are suggesting. I don't think so. And by the way, even ABC News, of all places, actually debunked the Harris claim that Trump had a quote-unquote senior moment on stage, and they ended up complimenting him for how he handled the situation.
But then, 30 minutes in, 2 attendees suffered medical emergencies.
A doctor, please. Doctor.
The incidents shifted the mood, prompting Trump to cut the question short and instead play some of his favorite music.
How about this? We'll play YMCA and we'll go home.
Trump kept DJing, and most of his supporters stayed for another 30 minutes of his playlist.
Well, in certain quarters of social media, people had a field day with that, and I guess on the screens it might have looked quite strange. Inside that hall, however, people were having a good time. What can I tell you? It did not seem out of the ordinary. It seemed almost intimate, and at the end, Trump did something he very rarely does. He came down off the stage and mingled with his supporters. He was signing autographs and shaking hands and the like. Today, he's doing an interview with Bloomberg in Chicago, and then he's heading to another battleground state, Georgia, for a rally tonight.
So why flounder like this? Well, there are a few key reasons. First of all, it looks like this is going to be a fairly high turnout election, and it's not entirely clear that that's a good thing for Democrats. It's not entirely clear that this is a very good thing. For example, down in Georgia, President Biden lost his ever-loving mind because in 2021, Georgia, under Brian Kemp, passed an election integrity law that Biden said was worse than Jim Crow. So America 2100 points this out in pretty good, succinct fashion. They say Biden said it was worse than Jim Crow. Then the media smeared it as racist voter suppression. And then a bunch of big businesses boycotted the state, said they wouldn't do business there anymore. Well, this is now the second election in a row where Georgia's voter turnout in the first day of early voting has broken all-time records. Over 300,000 have come out to early vote on day one. And it is not clear at all that these are all Democrats coming out to vote. This is what is making a lot of Democrats sweat. Number two, the FBI has now quietly updated their crime statistics from 2022. This is wild stuff. It turns out it was missing thousands of crimes. Oh, amazing. Wow. So now Biden has bragged about unemployment numbers in the country, only to find out that actually he has created far fewer jobs than he originally suggested. And in fact, a lot of them have gone to illegal immigrants. According to federally reported statistics, they have to keep correcting because Biden's administration was overly optimistic and just straight up lying about the data. And now it turns out the same thing is true about crime. The updated data from 2022 shows there were 80,000 more violent crimes than in 2021. Additional 1,700 murders, 7,700 rapes, 33,500 robberies, and 37,000 aggravated assaults. Now, you'll remember, of course, that the left threw an absolute fit. In fact, ABC News threw a fit during the debate. When Trump was talking about crime, David Murr actually tried fact-checking Trump with federal data from the FBI that they hadn't counted all the way, that now is completely tossed aside.
Crime is down all over the world except here. Crime here is up and through the roof. Despite their fraudulent statements that they made, crime in this country is through the roof. And we have a new form of crime. It's called migrant crime. And it's happening at levels that nobody thought possible.
President Trump, as you know, the FBI says overall violent crime is actually coming down in this country. But Vice
Excuse me,
President Harris,
the FBI they were defrauding statements. They didn't include the worst cities. They didn't include the cities with the worst crime. It was a fraud.
And so, yes, we are now in a position in which the left side of the aisle is flailing frantically for anything that'll stick, anything at all, because they've tried it all at this point. They can't go anywhere positive with Kamala. We will talk about that a little bit later in the show. There are serious problems Americans are concerned with in this present administration, and the whole Trump is a Nazi thing really didn't effectively work in 2020, and it's certainly not working now. And this is something they're going to have to confront. Well, up next, we're going to talk a little bit about some recent news regarding kind of the way that United States pharmacies are functioning and some possible closings. Stick around. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, live from Washington, and first on 93 WIBC.
This is the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated. There's a story that pops out of the news every once in a while that may not be the most groundbreaking, earth-shattering headline, but it sticks with you. And so as time ticks by, it's just one of those things that it just kind of keeps coming back. And one of those for me, at least out of the Midwest, and as a guy who shops there quite frequently, is that Walgreens is shutting down over 1,200 of its stores in the next couple of years. And this is something that's going to have a considerable series of impacts. So when we talk about considerable economic impacts, you got to bring on Professor Kimberlee Josephson, Professor of Business over at Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania. Kimberlee, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back.
So let's dig right into the brass tacks on this one, which I think Walgreens sells over in aisle 4. When we're looking at Walgreens shutting down a bunch of stores, the first question everyone's got is why?
Right. Well, actually, this has been a recurring issue for a few years now. There's been a rise in concern for what's known as pharmacy deserts. So most Americans live within about 5 miles of their local pharmacy, but we've seen some closures occurring, and actually Rite Aid even applied for bankruptcy, and they're now trying to rebound. But Walgreens has been seeing the high operational costs go up. We've been seeing lower enrollments actually at pharmacy schools. So in terms of pharmacists available. That's
so strange. Just because for one of our audiences, actually 2 of our audiences, because Arkansas also has a pretty big pharmacology program at Purdue University. In Indiana, there's a large pharmacology program. So it's kind of strange to hear of such a pharmacist shortage. I do want to ask, a lot of times those of us in the Midwest might think, well, it's probably because all of these stores are getting robbed on the coasts. Is that just one factor here, or is that the core factor? Help us get a little bit of a bigger picture.
Sure. No, that's just one of the factors. And that's at select communities and areas throughout the U.S.
Right.
It really is a little bit of everything. So in terms of the business model, how it's running, inflationary costs. At the end of the day, Walgreens is a retail. It operates as a retail unit, right?
Absolutely.
And so one of the things is, yes, it provides services for your prescription and pharmaceutical needs, but also it services local communities as a convenience store. Now, that being said, most convenience stores do charge a premium price for products such as your shampoo or your milk or things of that nature. And so most consumers are not frequently going there for those options anymore. Also, we see the rise in online and digital for pharmaceutical care and prescriptions and things of that sort. So both in terms of what their primary focus is, being a pharmacy, as well as their secondary purpose of, hey, we're a retailer. They are feeling the pinch of competitive pressures on that. And then once again, pressures from, rising costs, but as well as worker shortages. So a lot of things are kind of creating these pressure points. So Walgreens actually recorded a $3 billion loss. For underperforming stores, they have to shut them down. And I know it's really upsetting for some who are very nervous about losing their local pharmacy, but also, as a business, if the store is underperforming, this is something that they have to deal with.
That's a really good point. I guess I haven't really thought about the retail aspect of a pharmacy. Obviously, you have products that are maybe a little more expensive than perhaps at a Walmart or through a vendor like Amazon. But you're paying for the convenience of, getting to go to a local pharmacy. I guess with Dollar Generals and kind of other macro convenience stores that have been on the rise, that it does kind of take the feet out from under Walgreens. And when there's 2-day shipping for everything else, that really relegates only the pharmacy to the Walgreens pharmacy convenience store model. Is there anything that we're seeing here that looks like a way out of this for Walgreens other than shutting down stores and making these kind of pharmacy deserts?
Yeah, well, it is a big concern because also we will be seeing a rise in need for pharmacies as we have a growing and aging population. So the volume of patient care that is needed, so this is important. It's interesting that you brought up Dollar General. So Dollar General recently announced a few years ago their mission to help fight what's known as food deserts.
Food deserts, yep.
Right? What's interesting is, in addition to trying to fight food deserts, Dollar General is increasing their DG Health line, which is just, the over-the-counter drugs. So where these Walgreens closures are, I don't know if maybe Dollar General can help pick up the slack. Now, once again, they are not going to be doing prescription drugs.
Right, and especially controlled drugs and things, which we can talk about a little bit more later. Sorry, it's just, again, a small article. There's so many thoughts that spring out of this. Again, for one, someone who takes a controlled substance, where would I get the controlled substance? I can't just, waltz over to Dollar General and say, hey, I'd like this, class 2 federally locked substance. There's a lot of questions that spring out of closures like this.
Right. And the human element is really important. I know sometimes doing, by mail or ordering online can be cheaper, but having that connection with your local pharmacist who can say to you, how are you doing and how are you responding to this? And have you considered these other, options? And, we have a new generic version.
Heaven forbid you go to Google over micro symptoms and it tell you that actually you're 3 days from death's door or something that's completely different. You search dryness of mouth regarding a medication, who knows what you'll get on a search engine, whereas a pharmacist could say, that's kind of common, especially around here. There's something with the pollen that kind of kicks this in. You see that with Flonase a lot and things like that, and even some prescription level allergy medication. And I'm sorry, again, so many thoughts are popping into my head and I don't mean to cut you off. Please continue.
Oh, no, that's okay. And I mean, right now in the interim, it's a little scary, I think, wondering what's going to happen to your local pharmacy. There also is potential, though, for new entrepreneurial ventures to come about. I'm sure some of your listeners have heard about Mark Cuban's Cost Plus program for his, providing pharmaceutical medication. Also, so I'm from Pennsylvania, so there's a place out in Pittsburgh, I think it's called Blueberry Pharmacy, and they are a kind of cash-only upfront cost type of provider. So we do see some pharmacists trying to cut out the middlemen. If you've ever heard of these PBMs, so pharmaceutical benefits management organizations. So they pretty much are the middlemen or the intermediary between the pharmacy and the drug manufacturers. And that's created some problems as well in regards to the business model of these retail pharmacies. So we might see some creative opportunities come about, but it might be a struggle until that actually comes to fruition.
And I think that along those lines, you also, at least on the good side for Walgreens, I've seen them shift a lot of because of the shortage of pharmacists, they've shifted a lot of the prescription preparation to like distribution centers, but for pharmacies. They've created these centers where they do a lot of the cutting and the measuring and the sorting, and then they send those prescriptions out to local Walgreens for pickup. And I'm hoping, at least in the near-ish future, that, again, in Indiana, in central Indiana where I'm at, not today, of course, but there's a little bit where I think we're spoiled. For example, if I order something from Amazon in eastern central Indiana, it's to my door overnight almost always. Even here in Washington, D.C., if I order something overnight, it's not getting here for 2, 3, maybe 4 days, depending on the address given. And I hope that with Walgreens developing some of these distribution centers, maybe we can start to find a way around some shortages and, God willing, maybe a different alternative. Hopefully they don't do like Blockbuster in the face of Netflix and try to stick to old remedies for new problems,
Right. And I'm sure some of your listeners have been to pharmacies that are great and they operate smoothly and wonderful. I'm sure there's also a ton of them who have been to pharmacies where the line is like, just so long.
This would be a great time for me to have a pharmacy sponsor and be like, that's why I use XYZ Pharmacy for all of my drug needs. Unfortunately, we haven't found one of those yet.
I mean, one of the most important things for your listeners is to support their local pharmacy. So if you have the means to even shop there and frequent there as a convenience store, to really support them, because once again, they really cross-subsidize what it is that they make off of having that retail footprint that can help them with any of these operational costs or the pressures from drug pricing. There's been dwindling kickbacks happening for pharmacists. And pharmacists, it is a great profession. So I encourage anyone who is trying to think about a career path to consider it. But it is high stress, and depending on the location and where you are, sometimes it's a pretty intense and even lonely.
Yeah, sometimes you'll never sleep. Yeah, you'll be on your feet, dividing things for hours and hours and hours on end. That's why we need more of them, so they don't have to be on their feet for hours and hours and hours on end.
Correct. And then also, it minimizes the wait time and things. Now, for Walgreens or Rite Aid or CVS, it's to their advantage if you're kind of waiting a little bit because they're hoping you are going to browse those ails.
The old TJ Maxx long checkout line maneuver. I hear you,
Yeah.
Professor Josephson.
Yeah.
Well, again, when it comes to the practical aspects of some of these stories, that's why we love having you on. And I really do appreciate it. Professor Kimberlee Josephson out of Lebanon Valley College, you really have a great way of explaining things. And if I could say, kind of a kindred teacher spirit, and taking these kind of things and putting them on the lower shelf, I appreciate it, because this stuff is really going to affect a lot of the listeners and viewers of the show.
Yeah. Well, and the most important thing too is, I said, support your local pharmacy, but also, if you have an ailment or an injury or an infection, if you have to drive further for that pharmacy, you still make sure that you go and you find one and get it taken care of too, because that can always compound and make things even worse.
As
so trying to be healthy and happy,
As I think my favorite of Dr. Jordan Peterson's like rules for life is take care of yourself like you're taking care of someone else.
Yes.
You're always going to make sure for taking care of someone else. They're getting their medicine. They're getting what they need. Don't look past that. So, Professor Josephson, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated, live from Washington, D.C.
It's the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
Feels like I'm losing it.
With Kamala Harris continuing to trend downwards in the last couple of weeks before the general elections, the real question that we need to consider is why things went so poorly. Now, I know initially you can come up with 815 reasons why Kamala Harris' campaign fell apart. I've seen every single theory on social media. Okay, that's nifty. But what we really need to look at is the core problem that the campaign faces and the core issue that some are going to learn from and some are whistling right past the graveyard on. So this would be trying to run the current vice president, the incumbent vice president, as some kind of a change agent. Instead of Kamala, she's Changeala Harris. And the idea behind it is that people really don't like Joe Biden's administration. And unfortunately, people really did like the state of the economy, the state of the foreign affairs situation, at least the effects seen down the line regarding some of the crime policies, the tax policies, including kind of the opposite of the foreign policies that are now being carried out under this administration. There's a fondness for the mean tweets and the good policy of the Trump administration. So you can't run an incumbent against that effectively, because then you run into the particular case that Tim Walz and Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and many others have been caught lecturing voters, saying that actually they're wrong when they go into a grocery store and they think everything's too expensive and they blame it on inflationary policy of this administration. Now, I see a lot of people suggesting that the people to blame for this particular election is just Kamala Harris in general, that she's a really bad candidate. That's not actually the reason why. Yes, having a bad candidate matters. We talked about this over the last couple of years as well. The reason that Republicans stunk it up in the 2022 midterms was because they ran a bunch of crappy candidates who said, you know what, I'm just going to get up there and act like Trump, and that'll be enough to carry me over the line. Trump will endorse me, that'll be enough to carry me over the line. And they were just some real stinkers. They were uninteresting, they were just loud. That was their entire political appeal. And they thought, that'll carry me to victory. And there's a degree of that with Kamala, too. She'll get out there and she'll do all the joy, like the Count from Sesame Street, just, I guess, after a vasectomy. And then walk out there and clap her hands, and her vice presidential candidate will do the jazz hands and the flamboyance and whatnot. And that'll somehow carry her through if she just says middle class enough times in a row. That's not what sunk the ship. That's not. Because many people have pointed out fairly accurately that the media should have been able to cover for her and they just weren't because she's that bad at this. I don't think that's realistically what sunk the ship. I don't. I think that's a huge part of it. I think that's a big chunk of the pie. But when we're talking about the straw that broke the Kamala's back, we need to discuss the whole change agent thing. Biden's administration was and is unpopular with Americans. It is unpopular with Republicans, obviously. It is unpopular with independents by every available poll and metric. And it's very unpopular with 90s labor, Rust Belt, and Sun Belt moderate Democrats, especially men. And it's unpopular not just because of Biden's economic policies. It's not just unpopular because of Biden's border policies, although both of those are atrocious. It's a stench in the nostrils of many Americans because every single administrative decision that was made was done in a way that embarrassed Americans at large. And again, I don't mean Trump buying McDonald's for a team that went to the White House after the championship. That's something the media tells you should be really embarrassing that really doesn't matter. Appointing a dude in a dress to a high-level position in the Department of Health and Human Services, a fat, ugly-looking dude in a dress at that, yeah, that's embarrassing to Americans. Getting Americans killed when our withdrawal from Afghanistan was already going poorly, 13 American troops killed, that's embarrassing. And when you try to run Kamala Harris as a change agent from that, she should be able to come out and say, fairly effectively, there are some things that I would have done differently. There are some things that I would have done, if maybe we would have known more then. I've learned. I don't know what it is with politicians and their inability to say, earlier on in my campaign, I didn't know as much as I do now. Suddenly everyone gets to Washington, D.C. and they act like they've always known as much as they've always known and there's no more new knowledge or lessons that they can learn, nothing new they can obtain. I don't get that. If you go back to the first episode of this show, I do the show differently. Do you know why? Not only because I have learned different things about how operating a radio, TV show, and live stream work, but because I've also spent different amounts of time studying different issues during the day, including breaking news and in-depth policy and interviews. Hopefully I've gotten better at those things, and I do those things differently. It's okay. It's okay. One of the reasons that I'm a fan of Jim Banks, the representative who's currently running for Senate in Indiana, the reason I'm a fan of his personally is because he will admit there are things that he thinks should operate differently from when he ran for Congress as a representative and is now running for Congress in the Senate. I like that. The Biden administration, literally, you got Kamala Harris up in front of The View. Sonny Hostin asked her if there's something she would do differently, and she says not a thing comes to mind. I mean, even if you're going to pull out unicorn wishes, I wish these disasters didn't happen. And so I'm going to do everything in my power to minimize the risk that these will happen in the future. Not because, the Biden administration before did things that made those disasters more likely, but just now that I know these disasters are prevalent in today's day and age, I'm going to take these safeguards. That's all you got to say. That is a softball pitch. No, that is a Pee Wee League softball beach ball on the tee style question. Super easy to swing at. She won't do it. That's where the stupidity comes into play. But it also comes into play because of how the media are presenting her. It's how the media are trying to double, triple, and quadruple down on the change agent thing. So Mark Hamill, who's known for being both Luke Skywalker and a complete idiot, says, at least on X yesterday, said, in 3 weeks, elect her and return to normal. And then he included a hashtag, which, by the way, I just want to have a quick conversation here. Quit using hashtags. Hashtags are no longer relevant on any social media platform. Instagram, Twitter, X, Facebook, stop using them. They're over. It was over like 10 years ago. Quit using them to like say things. It's not how you get things trending. Stop it. Okay, sorry. Kamala Harris cares for us is his hashtag that he puts. But it's 3 weeks to go. In 3 weeks, elect her and return to normal. I'm sorry. How are we returning to normal? She's the current vice president. And not only is she just in the administration, kind of like Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State for Barack Obama, but we're looking at a situation in which Joe Biden gets in front of the country all the time and says Kamala Harris was instrumental in every single decision that he made, every law that was passed. She was literally the tie-breaking vote. One of the only 3 things the vice president does is break a tie vote in the Senate. She was the tie-breaking vote in the Inflation Reduction Act, which Biden even points out didn't reduce inflation at all. She cannot escape from it, also because she bragged about making all of the big decisions and being one of the last people in the room, for example, on the Afghanistan withdrawal. That's what sunk her this election. They backed themselves into a corner by picking her. That's what happens when you have DEI picks. They had to pick her because they put her in that position because she is a woman of color. The idea that her genitals and her skin color mattered more than her qualifications for the job is what sunk them, because then they tried to take, if Biden would have been a successful president, it would have been an easier sell. It would have been a tougher election. But instead, they ran her as a change agent. And that's what magnifies every other flaw. That's what is going to cost Harris this election. That's not overconfidence. That's a very acute analysis of why Democrats are so nervous. Polish a turd, still a turd. Sorry. We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated and live from Washington, D.C.
If you fall, I will catch you. I'll be waiting.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIPC.
Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here live from Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. And I was going to do a totally different segment about crime and inner city nonsense. And one of the reasons that Republican candidates are getting away with saying that there are a lot of cities in the United States that are just turning into complete dumpster fires. But we're going to have to save that for another time because we need to talk about one final thing about her gloriousness, Change Kamala Harris. And that is that I have yet to find a presidential candidate that sounds so much like that teacher. Everyone rolled their eyes whenever she would start to talk. So when I taught at, I don't even want to name the school because I know some of those teachers actually tune in to the show, and she's a very nice lady. But there was a teacher at one of these schools that I taught at who really loved kids and really loved her job. But whenever she would speak at some kind of a function or wherever she would have some kind of a point to make, she would just spout random platitudes. I mean, just the most soft adjective words like, we got to love our kids. We got to make sure that we really want what's best for them. And that means that we can never give up on our kids. And basically 34 different ways of saying that you try to do what's best for your students. And that would be her entire point. Whenever she'd do some kind of professional development, whenever she would do anything at all, even if it was just a small conversation with us after school, it was all garnish, no meal. The garnish looked great. I mean, nice soft words, very cutesy, nothing else there of substance, and therefore pretty effectively worthless. That is Kamala Harris. Nothing at all that she has said is of substance. So this comes from Nicholas Fondacaro. He pointed this out. He's the associate editor over at the Media Research Center and Newsbusters. Solid guy. We've had him on the show before. This is from a Kamala Harris campaign event in Pennsylvania today. And just a little bit ago, she said, "We're all in this together," like 3 times in 20 seconds. Check it out.
The approach truly requires that we understand we're all in this together. This is so much more than rhetoric or a campaign. It really is about tapping into the spirit of who we are as Americans. Because we are all in this together. We are all in this together.
So, first of all, I would like to ask the same question that Nick asks. Did she watch High School Musical, like, before she gave this speech? I just don't necessarily see how you can be running a presidential campaign in which there are notes in front of you, there are speeches to be given, and you cannot find more than one way to say that perhaps there should be some kind of bipartisan push in the country. Because she doesn't actually want a bipartisan push in the country, then she would be outlining things that Republicans value and Democrats value and trying to find common ground between the two, of which there is increasingly less as the parties continue to diverge ideologically. She's not going to do that, so instead all she has are platitudes. The very cheap, soft, good-feeling vibes and joy and words, and it's just not working because I can't pay for groceries with vibes and joy. And you repeating a line from a Disney musical isn't making my life any better. And I'm sorry, but Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger hold most of the rest of the middle of the country in severe disdain. So if you're talking about pulling Republicans up on stage with you, as Kamala Harris is doing, then you're probably going to need to find some Republicans that are respected by a majority of the rest of the party. It just doesn't fit, doesn't mesh, doesn't flow. And look, again, I am no saint when it comes to never repeating a line multiple times. Obviously, when you speak a lot in public, there are going to be lines that you say a couple of times too many. I've done it before. Heaven knows. My producers have hit me with all kinds of DMs. I think there are memes, actually, on the Slack that make fun of the number of times I've used a phrase over and over again. I get that. I don't disparage her of that, but at least sometimes I hope that I present you with an artifact, either of policy or of perhaps some kind of a clip, some type of a new piece of data, a story, a trend, something unique and interesting that flavors and excuses all of the lines that I repeat. Kamala Harris has all of the garnish and like the nice words that she says over and over, but there's no policy, there's no substance to back it up. The only thing she's been able to produce at all, I wouldn't even say effectively, that she's been able to produce as far as a policy suggestion are very flagrant violations of the Civil Rights Act in which she suggests race-specific forgivable loans only accessible to black men, which is wild. And then, panders to him and says that, black men really care about weed because all black men smoke weed. Okay. All right. That's a move. So going into this election cycle, when you consider why she ran on fumes so quickly, that's at the top of the charts. When you have no substance, all you have are these useless platitudes like saying we're all in this together 3 times in 30 seconds without... Zac Efron up on stage to dance behind you. I just don't think it's going to be effective. That's just me. We'll find out here in a couple weeks. Thank you very much for tuning in this evening. We'll see you tomorrow. This is the Tony Kinnett Cast, nationally syndicated from the Daily Signal. Tonight, live from Washington, D.C. See you tomorrow.